Hi everyone, welcome to TriEssence martial art channel for a special mini-series edition of Kung Fu Debunked. Now firstly, let me sincerely apologize for unable to upload any new video on my channel for over a year. Especially to my Patreon supporters, I sincerely apologize for the lack of new content. Unfortunately, the reality is I just currently do not have the capacity or the time to make content. The reason for is that firstly, last year I had this whole issue with a lawyer that was trying to scam me, who took a lot of time, and then study got really intense. And this year I'm on my third year, which is the final year for my bachelor's of psychology. So study is really intense, and furthermore, I really need to get good marks to have a good chance of applying for honors and then for masters. And with the honors and masters, I cannot practice as a psychologist. Furthermore, I'm also on the process of relocating to Australia, and my house is fairly big with nearly 3 decades of stuff that my parent has hoarded and accumulated. So I basically have to go through all the stuff to find out which are sentimental and I need to keep, what is valuable that I can actually resell, and then taking photos, clean them, list them online, try to sell them, and what is junk I need to throw them away. So this process is really taking up all my free time that I'm not spending on studying, which is why currently it's just unrealistic for me to consistently uploading new videos. With that said, the reason of this updating of new content is for 2 reasons. Firstly, I just finished my finals of the year, which means my study has concluded for the year until next year new semester begins. But more importantly, because recently there has been a viral event that happened in China that I think is a very good opportunity for me to cover a topic that I've been meaning to cover for a very long time, which is the fallacy of iron hand practice within Chinese martial art. So before I get into this topic, let's first get a recap of what happened recently that went viral and brings iron hand into questioning by the general public. So for the past 2 years or so, there has been this guy in the rural areas of Beijing with the internet username of Ge Wu Yuan. Right, he has been going viral on Chinese social media, including TikTok and Reddit Notes, where he makes short format videos where he demonstrates some pretty poor Tongbei techniques, in my opinion. Followed by a demonstration of his iron hand training, where he will either break bricks, hit Red Bull cans and poking holes in them.
这厉害，我也要去吧，那你就去吧。你是世界冠军，你是未来的泰森的爷爷的爷爷。
Hitting watermelons.
比如你拿个西瓜上门，可以说是去长见识，去打奖。
Breaking a sealed bottle of water.
水的水瓶模仿人的脸就打了下去。
And the most famous one is, hitting a wrench and bending it after a few hits.
去实战中试试，争议越来越大。
And because of this eye-catching demo, he has basically gone viral over Chinese social media with millions of views and become one of the most famous and recognized representative of traditional Chinese martial art, especially for Tongbei. Many in China for the past 2 years has considered him as one of the best representatives of Tongbei and Chinese martial art in general. Furthermore, UFC champion Zhang Weili has actually visited him, although one could argue that is probably more of a publicity stunt, but nonetheless he is recognized enough for the first Chinese female UFC champion to go and have a training session with him. That just shows you how much influence and recognition he has gained himself in the past 2 years. Now obviously, when someone gets this famous, there will be other people that try to write off his hype and fame. So naturally, people have starting to question the legitimacy of his Chinese martial art, in particular, the efficacy of his iron hand. Many of them are professional combat sport practitioners and athletes from either Sanda or MMA and boxing. And as expected, he has basically been evading any of these challenges from real practitioners of combat sport and has only accepted visitation from other internet celebrities that are not professionally trained. For example, bodybuilders, weightlifters, etc. And due to his consistent evading of actual professionally trained combat athletes, there is starting to be an opinion among Chinese social media that maybe he's not as good as he claimed to be. And that naturally would, damage his bottom line and profit margin, which is why recently he came up with this genius idea, at least to himself, that he knows that he can't fight, no doubt about that. He'll get his ass handed to him if he ever fought with someone that is actually properly trained. However, he does think that his iron hand is legit. So therefore, to quote the speculation and suspicion of his lack of real substance, he planned for his top student, someone called Zhao Honggang, to partake in the official power slap tournament. He thinks that, given that they have iron hand training, the hand hit like a brick, if he can partake in that tournament where you don't have to actually fight, right? So you don't have to expose your lack of fighting ability. People stand there and let you slap them. So he thought, given how hard their hand is, this would be surely an easy win. And if he could, slap and win a power slap tournament, that will prove that his iron hand is legit and will be able to quiet all the speculations and doubts people are having about him and his ability, and continue selling product and making money off the internet. And here is the clip of the actual match between his student Zhao Honggang versus the other competitor, which is a professional boxer. So as you can see, the result was quite surprising to Ge Wuyuan himself and his cronies. Obviously, I was not shocked by this result. I knew this would happen because Iron Hand is not as great as people think it is. Now, this video has gone viral and consequently has basically damaged Tongbei and Chinese martial art in general. Do people now look at this and be, wow, this guy that we all thought has been legit for the past 2 years turns out to be a scam like everyone else, like Lei Lei and others that Xu Xiaodong has called out back in the days. So it not only damages his own branding and profitability, it also damages Chinese martial art in general. But today I want to use this video as evidence to show that basically Iron Hand is not nearly as good as some people think it is. Now obviously people would say, okay, maybe he just don't do the legit Iron Hand, right? Maybe he's just bad. Maybe some other guy's Iron Hand is legit and would have won the tournament. So firstly, this is the typical mentality of confirmation bias, right? Basically, anything that disproves your belief, you discredit, and you only accept evidence that supports your belief. Now the problem with this type of mentality is that therefore, you will never be able to know if your belief is wrong, because you by default already think whatever you believe must be correct. And this type of mentality basically leaves no room for error correction and growth, and quite frankly is bad for the general growth and positive improvement of any type of martial art. And beyond that, today I would like to basically explain the fallacies of Iron Hand using scientific evidence to prove to you definitively why Iron Hand is not what people think it is. Which brings us to the first Iron Hand fallacy, which is, if you keep hitting hard things with your hand will become harder and almost as hard as the substance you condition your hands on. Now this extends from a very old belief in the Chinese culture, where back in the old day, people don't have the understanding that there are limitations to all type of growth and body adaptation. Right? There's this very famous old belief where they think that if you carry a small calf, baby cow, across the river, then as the baby calf grows bigger, your strings will grow bigger and eventually you'll be able to carry a full-grown cow across the river. Obviously, nowadays looking at it, we all know that is impossible because our muscles have a finite limitation to how much strength it can gain. And it basically, the growth or the body mass of a cow from calf to a grown adult cow far exceed the capability of a muscle, which is why this kind of belief is completely false. It's like a false equivalent. In a similar way, olden day Chinese people believe that if we keep hitting something hard, whether it's wood or iron pellet, then our hand will become as hard as wood or iron pellet. Now, this belief is also completely wrong. So to put some numbers right to my claim, an average healthy human adult, the bone density is anywhere between 300 to 600 megapascal. So that's how we measure density or the structural integrity. And you're welcome to fact check me on this if you really want to. But this is more or less what science understands as the cortical bone density of a healthy adult human. Now, iron and steel goes anywhere between 1,500 to 7,000 megapascal. So that is much harder than the capacity of our bones. And hitting iron is never going to magically make our bones as hard as iron. That is just simply impossible. Now, it is true that if you constantly stress out certain bones on your body, it would cause the body to basically calcify that bone and basically make it stronger. However, according to what we understand of biomechanics and how human body works, your bones can maybe improve between 15% to 20% more bone density, but it's never gonna become twice as hard or 3 times, right? So if you're looking at 300 megapascal, we're looking at the best maybe 330, 360, and if you take like the really upper limit of 600 megapascal, then at the base you're looking at an improved density of maybe 700 turbopascal, which is good, but is nowhere near the same hardness as iron or steel. No matter what you hit, that is not going to happen. And furthermore, because the improvement is only marginal at best, it doesn't actually give you the benefit that people perceive with on-hand training. Basically what I mean is that anything that you can punch after extensive on-hand training, you can probably punch without on-hand training. The only benefit we could argue is that with on-hand you desensitize the nerves on your hand, so your hand don't get as painful when you hit something hard, but it doesn't actually make your punching power magnitude more than someone that doesn't do on-hand training. And quite frankly, in Chinese martial art, we will even argue that if you get used to hitting hard things, it actually reduces the amount of power you can actually deliver. Because when you're hitting something like iron or something that's really hard, you instinctively withdraw some force. You're hitting the surface. You are not going to fully release and let your punch crush as far into the object as possible, which is why in my lineage of Tongbei, we actually believe that hitting something softer is far more beneficial, such as punching bag or bean bag, or something that is kind of compressible, so that when you hit, you're hitting into something that have some resistance but relatively soft. That kind of mirrors what human body feels like. Whereas if you take iron pebble and you put them in like a pretty packed, dense bag, and you put them on the table and you're hitting it, you are far less likely to unleash everything into the bag because then you injure your hand. And over time, if you keep hitting something on the surface like this, when you actually punch people, you're only punching on the surface. I'll discuss this more in detail in the second episode. In this video, we'll focus more on the scientific data. So the reality is no matter what kind of hard substance you hit with your hand, your bone only improves marginally at best in terms of density, and it doesn't give you any visible edge over people that doesn't try iron hand but regularly punches punching bags. Doing iron hand might marginally benefit your striking power. If you consider the amount of time you have to invest in doing it, the hard truth is that you would get much more benefit if you invest that same time training in something that is more informed by scientific research, such as doing bag work, mitt work, and other type of interactive striking training versus hitting a dead object such as a bag filled with iron filings. And this brings us to the second common fallacy when it comes to iron hand, which is that if you can break a brick or bend a wrench, you have devastating power when you hit someone. You're gonna crack bones and break bones. Unfortunately, this is also not true. Again, let's look at some scientific data. As I've already mentioned, healthy adult human cortical bone density is anywhere between 300 megapascal to 600 megapascal. Now, what is the hardness of bricks? If I were to ask people, what do you think is harder, our fist or brick? I think a lot of people would think, naturally that the brick must be harder, which is why people get impressed when iron hand people hit a brick and the brick cracks. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. Reality is that the hardness of brick is anywhere between 10 to 40 megapascal, which is around 30 times less than the structure, integrity, or the hardness of our human bones. So what this actually means is that you don't need years of iron hand training to break bricks. Basically, any healthy adult human could break a brick so long as they have sufficient striking power and they have the correct technique and the setup. A common setup, as you will see in a lot of these iron hand demos, is that they keep the brick elevated. So the one side they touch a table, other side they will put onto some object, so to keep the brick slanted and elevated, so that when you hit the middle, there's room between the table and the brick, so that it can actually, and there are two ends that's holding the brick in place, so the force that comes diagonally would basically cause the brick to crack. And under that setup, if you just have a fairly snappy and sufficient amount of force that almost all healthy adult human can deliver, the brick will basically snap. And the brick is far more likely to break than your hand because, again, healthy bones are roughly 30 times harder than conventional bricks. And furthermore, if you really pay attention to these iron hand demonstrations, they actually opt to use the cheapest brick you can get. Often those bricks, once you break them, you see red dust going everywhere, or it's coming off the part that breaks from the brick. That's a sign that those are extremely cheap bricks when comparing to proper hardened bricks that you use for good quality construction. Put some numbers on it, like really low quality cheap bricks, the hardness can be as low as 2 megapascal. And keep in mind, human bone is about 300 to 600. As you can see, there's very low risk in hitting a brick that is only 2 to 10 megapascal in terms of breaking your hand versus breaking the brick. The reason most people can't do it is not because they physically can't, but it's because they mentally are scared to hit harder because they think they might break their hand. And obviously because of the pain, which arguably iron hand can teach you to condition away, would allow you to hit the brick more confidently, which then enables you to break the brick. However, the most important thing here is that just because you can break a brick, it doesn't translate to break somebody's bones when you hit them. Besides the obvious fact that the brick is set up in a specific way, allowing it to break as easily as possible, whereas if you're punching a person who's moving, you can't set them up in such a way that the two sides holding against the bone that you can break it. So besides that obvious point, also because adult bones are much harder than brick, so breaking a brick is no way close to equal to the ability to break somebody's bones with a strike. Which is why this entire fallacy of iron hand being a deadly hand conditioning striking method is utterly absurd. Now, another argument that I sometimes hear is that people say by doing iron hand training, it teaches you to avoid injuries when you're hitting something bare knuckle, because you get used to hitting something hard and you learn to hit it in the correct angle to maximize impact and minimize injury. Now, it is true that if you take an untrained person, even though his bones are hard enough and he has the strength to break a brick, if you hit the brick wrong, for example, with a crooked wrist or non-tightened finger, then yeah, there's a chance that he might break his hand rather than breaking the brick. However, this kind of injury is not because the hand or the bones are weaker than the brick, but rather because our hands, especially the knuckle and the fingers, are made from complex structure of small bones. So the bones themselves are quite durable and hard, but what connects these little bones are not all that durable. So if you hit in the wrong place, there is a chance you might actually break your knuckle, but by breaking, it's probably breaking the connection space between each knuckle rather than the knuckles themselves. So that is true. However, hitting something dead on a table does not equate to hitting something that is moving, which is why even if you have the most perfect angle and technique on hitting something hard, whether it's iron filing bag or whether it's bricks, it doesn't mean you can hit the same way or the same angle precisely when you're fighting somebody that is moving around. So therefore, I kind of do agree that to a very limited extent, hitting something hard do teach you how to hit something hard when you are fighting. However, I would argue that the benefit is also pretty marginal, simply given the fact that when somebody is moving, you can't guarantee that your fist will connect in the correct angle you intend to. And sometimes you aim it at the right angle, but because he moves, you're going to connect in the wrong angle. And even someone that has trained extensively on iron hand, if he does, for example, a body shot, and then someone lowers his elbow and his fist connects to somebody's elbow, his fist and his knuckles will be injured, regardless of what kind of iron hand training he has, because simply put, the bone density between someone that's trained and someone untrained don't vary all that much. Remember, it's only about 15 to 20% at max. And the elbow is just a much more durable piece of bone versus your knuckles. So regardless how you train, it's not going to help you if you hit the wrong place. Which again brings to my original point that even though there are some arguable benefits in doing iron hand, it just doesn't really justify the amount of effort you have to put in, and you could much better invest that time in more efficient training if you are trying to improve your overall combat efficiency. And now I know that this video is probably going to anger some people out there that spend their whole life doing iron hand training and swear that this has made them the most deadly human weapon to ever walk on earth besides Bruce Lee. Well, and if you feel that way, there's no point arguing with me because it doesn't really solve anything. I have provided my scientific data. You can fact check on those, and quite frankly, you can't argue with scientific data. And if you disagree with that, then the best thing to prove is to enter yourself into those power slap tournaments and see how well you do compared to people who don't do iron hand training. And here, there's also another common fallacy that you should be aware of, is that just because somebody trains iron hand and then they did well in a power slap tournament, it doesn't equate to iron hand being better than other training method in power slap tournament. Because there's something that in science we call confounding variable, right? Is that doing A and then having a result B doesn't automatically means there's a causational relationship. What that means is that just because you did A and then B happened doesn't mean doing A caused B to happen. So in this case, what I mean is maybe someone trains iron hand and he did well in the power slap tournament. That doesn't prove anything. What we need to know is, do they do systematically better overall than people who don't do iron hand training? So the only way to really settle this or to prove that iron hand is really great is to have, let's say, 10 or 20 people who extensively train iron hand, and we put them into power slap tournaments, and then we take another 10 or 20 people who don't do iron hand training but do the other training that people regularly do for power slap tournaments, and we put them against each other to see which side performs better overall. This is the only way where if you want to prove the efficiency of iron hand. And this is something that often people confuse us with, because they'll be like, I try iron hand and hits people and it's really hard. What they don't know is maybe you hit hard even if you didn't do iron hand training, right? You've never tried before iron hand training. And also maybe you say, okay, but I did iron hand and hit it harder than before. But then you have to ask yourself, but did you do other training at the same time? Right? That's what I mean by a confounding variable. For example, before you did iron hand, you didn't do Chinese martial art and you didn't hit as hard. And then when you did my Chinese martial art, you start doing iron hand, but you start doing push-up, you're hitting pad, you're hitting back, you're doing other strength training, and then you hit harder. In which case, you don't actually know what is the main contributor for you hitting harder. Is it iron hand or is it something else? And based on all the data we have to this day, i.e. the fact that there's no iron hand practitioner that has a clear advantage over regular combat sport athlete, I think it's pretty safe to say that iron hands do not provide a great or significant advantage in terms of hand-to-hand combat versus people who do not train iron hand. Which is why I would advise everyone watching my video to not waste your time on iron hand. If you want to do combat, there are far more efficient ways of training. Now this concludes my video on the fallacies of iron hand. I will be making a part 2 of this video where I discuss the technique that Zhao Honggang uses and the general misconception of the whip power in Tongbei and how that is also a fallacy, and that's what basically is responsible for the poor performance of Zhao Honggang when he was hitting somebody else. And lastly, I would like to give a big thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Again, I apologize for unable to update any new videos, and therefore I am not going to advertise my Patreon channel. And I perfectly understand if you have been a supporter and you stop supporting because I haven't been uploading video. I perfectly understand that. So I'm not advocating for anyone to sign on to my Patreon channel anymore because I simply do not have the ability to make new videos. However, I will be making a third part of this mini-series where I go into the details of how we understand how to slap and circular hand according to my lineage of Wuxing Tongbei, and compare and contrast that to what Zhao Honggang's lineage is doing to see how they misunderstood the application and purpose and techniques of slapping. This will be a Patreon only video. However, if you have been my Patreon supporter for the past year and you have stopped because I haven't been uploading videos, you don't have to re-sign to my Patreon channel to access this video. Just give me a message and I will private message you the link to this part 3 Patreon only video in order to show my appreciation for those of you who have been supporting me all these years. That'll be all for today. Thank you for watching TriEssence Martial channel, and I'll see you in part 2.